we did this on Friday. We went through this exercise on Friday with the fire door group, and we found that it was beneficial to change our modus operandi to what we're going to do today. What we're going to do is we will go through each question, look at the answers we've got. There's Suzanne. Hi, Suzanne. There you go. We're going to go through each question individually, look at the answers that are there, and then we're going to ask you to, if there's anything you think's missing, put that into the chat, and then just will live put it into the document. Okay, we'll obviously have little chats within that, but the challenge is to try and complete as many of those questions as we can, so we get final output. Okay, so just, do you want to put the questions on screen?
Richard, just before we go into that, do you mind if I just say something with regard?
No, of course not.
Yeah, what we're doing. What we've recognised and discovered is that we've got quite a wide range of people who need different information for different purposes. So, for example, the people that are responsible for maybe procuring works, what they are particularly focused at in many cases is appointing somebody that is properly certified and experienced and competent to carry out the work. And really, it's becoming apparent that they probably don't want to know too much detail about what the competent person does, because that, you know, it would just be overwhelming if they had to check everything that everybody's doing, and that's recognised. So I think in terms of this session is concerned, let's recognise that we are all of the view that we need to have competent and qualified people carrying out works. But that in itself isn't enough, because there's other members of this stakeholder community who maybe be instructing those people to carry out the works, and therefore they're going to need the next level of detail, maybe even a detailed schedule of work, step by step of what they've got to do. So the important thing with this is that what we're trying to do is to identify all of the information that all stakeholders might need for any circumstances, right? And then what, from a software engineering point of view, you don't need to worry about that. If we've got, for example, against an asset type, 200 bits of information, of which maybe you're only interested in 3 or 4 bits of that information, don't worry about it. What we really want to make sure of is that in this community, the 4 or 5 bits of information that you consider to be critical, we want to ensure that that is captured. Yeah. And then within, from a software engineering point of view, whatever software applications you're actually going to use to deploy that information, you'll be able to filter out all the stuff you don't want, so you only see the stuff you do. But the master data model needs to incorporate everything. Okay, so I just wanted to place that in there, because we did spend some time on Friday with people saying, well, actually, no, we don't want to know that. We don't need that level of detail. But in practice, overall, somebody needs that level of detail, and therefore we want to try and accommodate it. And I've got just a couple of examples that I'd like to just show on that, if I may. I compiled this for the fire door session on Friday, so please bear with me that it's not cavity barriers, but you're all involved in this whole area. So if I just explain this. Can you see my screen okay? Can people see my screen? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So what we're really saying is that what we want to do isn't just about new build construction, because the biggest job is around looking after existing buildings. So if, for example, I need to procure a new fire door, what we've discovered is if you look at the MBS specification for a fire door, you'll see that there's quite a lot of things that really a maintenance engineer, or maybe somebody that's in a procurement department of an FM company, would not easily be able to interpret. So you've got the specification, which then requires them to look at British standards. They've then got to look at the fire plans, and also then probably look up a door schedule and then be able to interpret that. And the problem is, what about the door closer, the hinges, the lock, the intumescent strip, etc.? So what we're saying is that we need to have much more explicit information, and that information is not generally available in PDFs in an easy way. So here we've got one schedule here. Sorry, this is a data sheet from a manufacturer, and you can see here we've got fire rating clearly shown, but it's only human readable, not computer readable. Here we've got the same information, but it's presented quite differently. And here we've got another where it's presented differently again. So the only way to know whether the information that somebody might need to know about that fire door is to manually go and read everything that goes into the O&M manuals. And, you know, quite frankly, that information may not be there. And certainly, in my experience, a lot of the other constituent parts that are needed for that fire door, like the ironmongery and the door closer, they're not actually there. And there's a perception that BIM sorts it all out, whereas in fact it doesn't, unless we require it. So we need to standardize the way this information is presented. Here we've got different ways of describing a 30-minute fire door. And this is the major thing that I think helped people on Friday to understand. This is the BIM data that you would typically collect or have in a BIM model. Most of these questions don't get answered in the BIM model, but that's another question. But that looks to, I think, most people as an overwhelming level of detail in there. So if, for example,
George, can we speed it up a little bit?
Yeah. If we've got compliance in here, then you know, the people that are responsible for compliance perhaps are only interested in 4 or 5 bits of information, but there's other members of your team, maybe design, operations, and environmental, who might need other information sets. So the point about it is, let's collect all the information, and then we can then filter it out. Okay, that's me.
No, I think that's a good point. We need as much as we can get. There's no such thing as too much. We can filter, but we can't filter what's not there.
Exactly.
Just, can we get the first question up? Excellent. Now, can everybody read that? All right. Can anybody not read that? It's in blue, which is possibly not the best colour. Actually, I can't read it. But can anybody not read it?
Could you just zoom? Yes, yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Is that okay now?
I would also
Yes.
like to apologise for the fact I've only just spotted that Chris Hall sent me his feedback, and I missed it last night. So Chris Hall, if there are things that are missing from this that you put in your notification, please speak up, or drop them into the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, drop them into the chat, Chris. Sorry about that.
We'll incorporate them, but if you want to, we've actually got them. So
yeah, okay. So everybody can see those answers that we've got there. Yeah, I'm not going to read it out to you. You can read for yourselves, can't you? Have a look at those. So, Edward, is there anything that you can see, you can think of that is glaringly missing?
Well, I think the lower two probably cover it in most detail, in the sense of what are we actually trying to protect here. And although there's a focus on wall cavities and external walls naturally, given the history, actually, if you look at ADB, the definition of a cavity is far broader than that. It's any concealed space. So we've got to consider there's different types of cavity barrier that we might be looking at.
Yeah,
so
this is obviously what complicates things rather. But just let me just say, this has not been deduped, so there will be some duplication on these. We were getting answers right through to the last minute, so we've not had time to kind of edit it. If you'd forgive us for that. So, Edward, as far as you're concerned, that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, you want a description that's not too long and wordy, so it's accessible to everyone. But yeah, I think that the lower ones work in a sense.
Okay, Chris, is there something of yours that we've missed?
No, the second paragraph down is my attempt at trying to describe them. And you're right, Edward. We shouldn't forget cavity barriers come in many shapes and sizes, and cavities exist in many forms. It's natural that the focus is on cavities in external walls, but they're not the only cavities.
Edward, can I ask you to pop that in the chat? And then just we'll copy that over as a consideration that we need to when we're writing this up, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I think it's there.
Is it there?
Yeah, it's the second and the third and fourth paragraphs, I think.
So it is covered.
Yeah, the third one definitely does.
No, that's fine then. That's fine. So, does anybody else feel there's anything that should be added into this, or do we all think that it's covers everything?
I'd just like to make a comment on this, Richard. Suzanne picked up quite correctly something that we were discussing yesterday in one of the Golden Thread Initiative chairs meetings, and that is that the Health and Safety Executive are looking at things from a point of view of their perspective. So coming back to what I was saying earlier about different stakeholders wanting different things, they're driving the agenda. So they're driving the agenda towards the things that are important to them. And one of the things that we were briefed with was that they wanted us to focus on things that were catastrophic and that were low incidence, high impact. Yeah. Now that's cool. Yeah. But in doing that, that was when they made the comment to me that the spread of that fire in a flat isn't a risk that they want to be bothered about. That's paraphrasing that. The spread of fire, and Suzanne quite correctly said that from our perspective, from an operational perspective, fire in a flat is important. Or I mean, I'm sure it's important to everybody, but it is something that we need. So Suzanne, do you want to say something about that?
Sure. Yes. I said it depends on who your audience is, or who who you are. Depends on your perspective of risk. In that, if from an enforcement perspective, only the fire brigade, the HSC, the regulator are only interested in a fire that spreads beyond the flat of origin, because that's within the legal remits. From a housing perspective, we're interested in all fires because there's a risk of life, risk of death in a serious fire in a flat, even if it doesn't break out from the flat of origin. It then, and if you're the owner, occupier, leaseholder, tenant, there's a risk. You're worried about the risk of fire in your own home from doing life safety and property damage. So I do think it depends on who the audience is, depends on your risk appetite, risk interpretation. So the HSC's definition of a risk of a risk of fire doesn't go beyond a flat is a very sort of narrow view in there.
So Suzanne, is there something, so that being the case, and I totally take your point, is there something you would add on to this list?
Well, I think you need to add that there is a risk, cavity barriers. Why do we put cavity barriers in? Because we want to stop a fire from spreading across a block of flats. But from a housing perspective, from a landlord's perspective, we want to stop the spread of fire from flat to flat, from an asset perspective, from a property perspective. There's not just a life safety, but there's also a property perspective.
Sure.
That the HSC
Suzanne,
and regulator are not interested in.
Suzanne, could I ask you to pop that in the chat?
Yes.
Pop that in the chat, then just will magically cut and paste it and put it onto the live dynamic document.
I'll do that now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Is anybody else who's I mean, that was obviously quite a significant addition. Has anybody else? Dave, what about you, Dave Peacock?
No, I can't go into anywhere near as much detail as some of the others on the call in terms of the technical information on that. But
so you're happy?
Yeah, oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I'm coming at it more from a BIM and digital perspective than a cavity barrier perspective. So yeah, I totally agree with what's been said so far.
Absolutely, Peter. Last shot. All good?
Yeah, looks good for me. Yeah.
Excellent. So unless anybody has a different opinion, I'm going to tell Gis to cut and print.
Okay,
once he's got Suzanne's in there.
Richard, just before we move on to the next one, whilst we're still on risk, let me show you something that was that's been shared with me yesterday, which is work in progress. What Nick Nisbet is trying to do, one of my colleagues, is trying to put risk in the context of Uniclass. Okay, so that we've got a common way of considering risk. So what he's doing, he's one of the authors of PAS 1192 Part 6. So what he's been doing is working with MBS to actually start to create a series of additional levels of risk so that we can then underpin these with the information. Sorry, I've shut off onto the other side. And therefore, what we probably want to do is to have whatever risks we identify underpinning this this level here, and then the idea is that we can then start to have measures that mitigate these risks as a standard way of addressing them. So really, this is just feeding into the whole process of standards. Okay.
Okay, good. Right. So, just question 2. If we can get that. Sorry, I know you're also doing Suzanne's inputs, but if you don't mind. Excellent. George, do you want to introduce this question?
Yes. Yeah. So what we're trying to do here is to go down to the next level of detail to say about each asset type, what information do we really need to know about it? Now, there's I was going through this actually with Chris Hall from CyberEyes yesterday, and we've got another working group within BIM4Housing called the Housing Association Data Group. So what we're doing is looking at each of the asset types that go into residential developments, and then saying what information do we need about them, and importantly, what information don't we need. And cavity barriers is a particular challenge because it's actually a composite, there's a number of different types of cavity barrier that are used in different circumstances. So one of the things that we've done to try and deal with that is that we've been working with BRE, and I'll just show you what we're doing, because what I'd like to do is see if we can get some volunteers from this group to see if you'd be interested in actually defining what there is. So if we actually look at this is something that you might know called the harmonized standards. I didn't really understand any of this, but really this is a European standard for saying that a cavity barrier, what information is needed against European standards against it. But the other point is that it's actually made up of lots of different components. So the work that we've been doing with the BRE is to say that a cavity barrier is made up of a number of different constituent elements. And then we've looked against those constituent elements, and then we've looked at what are called the essential characteristics. This is coming from the Declaration of Performance side of things that manufacturers have to work with. And you'll see here down in this left column, in this first column here, you've got the different values, which, for example, in the list that Pauline's given us, out quite a few of these. I don't know whether you've actually used this, Pauline, as your source, but it would be great if all manufacturers and all people are actually working off the same data sets. Interestingly, I've gone on to MBS, and this is the MBS cavity barrier model. And what we've got here, everything that's in yellow is standard COBie. So that means that's nothing special to the fact it's a cavity barrier. Whereas this information here, fire performance and free air provision, these are things that MBS has determined are important to match with that. And finally, this is one that Chris has shared with me, which has come from the work that they've done with, I think this is the National BIM Library that they've commissioned. So they've got a series of terms down here like fragility rating and surface spread of flame that are important, but a lot of their information again is just standard COBie. The final bits we've got here, we've got this ETIM is the wholesalers information sets. Now for cavity barriers, that probably, from what Chris tells me, you probably wouldn't supply through wholesalers, but maybe there's some of the materials that are defined earlier that would be. So ETIM is the European or world standard that wholesalers are working to. Okay, that was it really.
Okay, cool. George, if you're going to go off piste a bit on your intros, could we do that after we've answered the question?
I was trying to put that in the context of this question, which is about what information to know about assets.
Okay, then. So we've got that. Can you scroll down, Jess? How many responses have we got there? Right, we've got quite a few. So what I suggest is, Jess, if you put that that question in the chat, so that everybody can have a read of that through that now, rather than try and do it on screen. Is that there? Has everybody got access to that now? No.
I think
Ask me to request access. I don't know if that's everybody or.
Have you got that, Peter?
No, it just said to request access.
Same for me, request access.
Request access. Can't you just put a document on there instead of this silly sharing lark?
No, I couldn't attach a document to the chat.
Yeah, this share space thing is always a disaster. When you've got that up there, can you make sure all the other questions will load properly?
Yeah, sure.
Richard, just whilst he's doing that, I think there's a couple of things here. One is the explicit set of questions that or answers that that Pauline has given earlier. Could you scroll up a second, Jess? That's an important element of what we're trying to get to. So in other words, what are those, what are those items? So, and the properties behind them. And Chris, would you contribute on my complete confusion about all the different elements that go to make up a cavity barrier, and what information do we need to know about those individual elements? You're on mute, Chris.
It depends how granular you want to be. Typically, when you're selling a cavity barrier, you are selling the performance of the combined product. Typically, a cavity barrier, if we just stick with cavity walls for a moment, would be the actual cavity barrier element itself. There would be brackets for fixing, and there would be ancillaries, maybe tapes and intumescence for making good around penetrations. So you would sell those as the finished product, and you would provide data for that as a finished unit. Would you be required to go down to the origins of the components? Probably not, in my opinion, because then you're into multiple layers upon layer of information that's not really relevant, because a cavity barrier is being used for its performance characteristics. So what you really need to know is, what is it intended, what is it designed for, and how has it been tested, and how has it been accredited, and how is it fixed? Those are the basics that you need. And this particular list that I'm looking at now is quite good. I mean, you could go on ad nauseum, and you made the point that some people want to know a little bit more, and that's absolutely fine. But at the operational level, you need to know, is this a cavity barrier that's fit for its intended application, and does it meet the requirements of the design? In other words, does it have the required insulation and integrity classification, and has the installer been trained how to install this particular product?
Chris, I've seen EAD interpreted to mean that a tile is a system because it requires a finish and an adhesive. Would you consider that drilling down too far?
No, in terms of a cavity barrier, they don't hang on sky hooks, so they generally need brackets. So you have the cavity barrier itself, and then you have a bracket arrangement to actually fix it to one of the substrates. And then you generally have finishing items that allow you to deal with joints and penetration. So yes, it is a system. We see it as a system. You also have to bear in mind, if you, and this is quite a common problem, if you use systems from different manufacturers, say for example, you use a horizontal cavity barrier from Siderise and a vertical cavity barrier from Rockwool, you're in trouble, because you've introduced a variable. You can't do that because that's just not a great idea, because they haven't been tested in concert. And so you get, and I'm talking about, maybe this may or may not be relevant, you'll often see someone will say, I like the cost of your cavity barrier horizontally, but I'm going to buy the vertically from someone else. And then when it gets to site, the manufacturers are then asked to sign off, in inverted commas, on the installation. And we all have to say, sorry, non-compliant, not my product.
Yeah.
So you have to look at things in systems, and you also have to go to the build, because if you've got multiple cavity finishes as well, say for example, you've got a curtain wall and you've got a rain screen, and you've used different manufacturers there, where the junction of the rain screen meets the curtain wall, you have a problem with the interface.
So Chris, in terms of our list of questions and answers, what would you add on to number 2?
I think it's quite that's not bad. I mean, we could be here all day. I could carry on.
Of course, yeah, but within reason.
Okay.
Within reason.
Cavity seal, substrates, surrounding substrates. That's absolutely fine. That covers. Yeah.
Fantastic.
That's a good.
Right. Anybody else? Response. Anybody else see anything? Pauline, can you see anything there that you think should be added in? Anything missing?
Well, no, that was the list that I produced, and that was as many things as I could.
Right. Well, you would agree with it then, wouldn't you?
Yes, so I agree with that.
Well, so far, you're on 10 out of 10, Pauline.
Thank you.
Steve, how about you? Anything missing from your point of view?
No, I think it's all covered there quite well.
Yeah. Peter.
I don't know if you can scroll down to the ones just underneath. Just have a quick read. That looks good. What's the third perspective? Is it another P? Product, process.
Yeah, there's a little bit more.
People.
Sorry, that should have been in the future read. I apologise for that.
Yeah, could I just picking up on what Chris was saying? I think the thing that was missing from it was the interfaces.
Interfaces.
Yeah, so how one product interfaces with another. Because at some stage it will interface, even if you're not mixing.
Well, George, do you want to put that in the chat so that just can whiz it over?
Yeah.
By the way, there's nothing to suggest that the products wouldn't work perfectly well together. It's a
but they're not. They haven't been tested together. That's the issue.
They haven't been tested, and it's a question of liability and product liability and professional indemnity and all of that other good stuff that we all have to have to.
It all goes up the spout, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The other question I was going to raise was one that seems to be being missed, is the individual instance or the individual location of that particular cavity barrier in that context. So what do we need to capture about that individual piece of material or component going into that particular location? That's one of the things that I think is often missed. We end up with
what location specific issues, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The fire strategy for the building, informed by the building regulations and the fire engineer, should determine where the cavity barriers are to be positioned. And if any building doesn't give that, then you need to go back to the designers and say, where do you want cavity barriers? Or they'll build it. Approved document B gives you a guidance. That's just guidance. It's down to the individual buildings.
I think George isn't so much talking about the where they're specified to actually be geographically, more in terms of how the location affects the performance. Is that right, George?
Yeah, well, two things really. One is what information do you need to capture about the individual item? So, in other words, photographs, for example.
Okay.
We're finding people are asking for photographs of the item, of the cavity barrier.
Yeah.
And after.
So
jump in there.
You're talking about post-installation inspection.
Yes.
Okay.
Ed?
Yeah, it's just to follow on. It's actually locating that particular product where it's actually used, because you may have different products. You need to be clear where you've used it in the building, and actually some clarity on its application, because we do have different types of cavity barrier. One that's suitable for walls is going to be no good in the roof void.
Correct.
So it's just a classification of different types of cavity barriers probably needed in there.
So in terms of our answers, Edward, what would you put there then?
I suppose it's adding in there, location a particular product is used or an item is used, and what it's the intended purpose of that item. So
could you pass that onto the chat for me?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat. So easier.
Thank you. Okay, Pauline, have you got access yet?
Yeah, I've got it now, just as email.
You don't need it anyway because you wrote it, didn't you? How are we doing? Suzanne, anything to say? Anything to add?
No, just listening. Taking it all in.
Okay, so once Jess has finished his cutting and pasting, with the latest comments. Are we happy with this? Is anybody not happy? Push the little button to raise your hand or something, because I can't see everybody. Anybody unhappy? Oh, I'm getting thumbs ups. That's nice. And rare, let me tell you. Okay, excellent. We're doing very well indeed. George, do you want to give a brief intro into number 3? Jesse, are you up to date with your comments?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. Just can't talk. He can't have his mic on because they've got workers outside his house, and we wouldn't really hear him. Right, number 3, George, go for it.
Okay, so one of the things that is a given is that we want to be encouraging and in fact actually probably demanding the use of qualified and competent people. So I'd like to take that particular question out of the equation for the moment. That's a given. But what we've also found is that even competent people that have been properly trained don't necessarily follow the right tasks and procedures because they're humans. And they therefore, in another workshop that we had in December on cavity barriers, Sharon McClure, who's one of the experts in this area, she was saying that you've got qualified people arriving on site, but there's so many different types of cavity barriers. They'd not actually been trained on that particular cavity barrier. So therefore, what we've in the M&E maintenance world, what we've been doing for several years, they've been developing standardized sets of tasks and procedures that everybody can then have as documented processes. So not just to say that something needs to be maintained every 6 months, it's that you've got to do these 8 tasks every 6 months. So it becomes a checklist. And we think that by having that same type of rigor, it means that we've got a method of basically reinforcing the issue of competence with something that then is auditable, which we think is important. But that I'd like your views on that from the point. So that's why the method statements are more than simply saying we need somebody that's got the right qualification.
We move into competency on the next one, don't we, George?
Yeah, but the tasks
I know they're going to overlap, obviously. Yeah, just so that everybody's aware that the on focus.
Yes.
Okay, just have you loaded this up onto the chat? This number 3.
I'm loading it up now.
You load it into the chat now. Okay, if you scroll down a little bit so that everybody can see what we've got already. Oh, it's a lot, isn't it? Okay, well, just let's see the top bit, and that's a start.
So we've got different types of inspection, for example. What we're thinking is that if we can have a standardized set of tasks that people can then add to or subtract from according to what type of cavity barrier it is and also the context of it, then that would be a useful thing. Would you agree with that, guys?
If I could come in here, this is an area where we have a considerable practical experience. I'd like to start with the comment, might be slightly controversial. Employing a specialist in inverted commas doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a good job, unfortunately. That's the nature of the beast. Secondly, the training courses that are available for installing cavity barriers are very, very generic. And whilst they have a value in their own right, they have to be supplemented by training from the manufacturer in the application of their particular products, because at the end of the day, often the manufacturer is going to be asked to come back and make a final inspection. And if you've used the wrong brackets or haven't fixed them correctly, because the training course from the ASFP or the ABC or the NFRC said you did it in a different way, that's unfortunate, but that would happen. So I think you're going to have 2 levels of training, George. A basic level of understanding, we'll call it a foundation course, and then manufacturer specific training. There's also the question of the practical implications of using specialists. I'm now a bricklayer and I want to install a cavity barrier. And now all of a sudden I have to stop what I'm doing and get along someone to install a cavity barrier. So my work is now interrupted. There's all kinds of program implications of the use of specialists in inverted commas. So I think the training has to be widened out to include other trades that would traditionally fit cavity barriers, because the fact of the matter is that they're not terribly complicated to do. So from that point of view, I think we've got to be careful here that we don't build in cost, complication, and challenges on site by over-egging it, as it were. But I think it's going to come down to the fact that manufacturers need to be obliged, bludgeoned, dragged kicking and screaming to make sure that if they sell a product, then they have a duty, be that moral, ethical, or statutory duty, to be able to provide the right installation training for that product to be installed correctly.
And is there any work going on within your community to try and standardize how those instructions are delivered? Because clearly, if everybody's doing their own...
Unfortunately, George, not. For some people have seen it as a marvelous opportunity to sell training, and they've jumped on the bandwagon and they're charging people £400 or £500 a day for something that I could do for them in half an hour. But that's just the nature of the beast. That's a generalization. The ASFP are doing some good work. The NFRC have started a course on specifically to do with installing cavity barriers in ventilated facades. The Association of Brickwork Contractors are doing something, but they're all disjointed, and they are good in a sense that they provide the basics, but the basics also have to be supplemented by the manufacturers training people how to install their products. So the checklist would help, George, but it also needs a bit of a cultural change at the manufacturer level for them to buy into the fact that they are responsible for the training of the installers of their products.
There's work going on at the moment, I know, with UCAS or to develop a UCAS series of accreditation, and because it's clear that the different organizations that are delivering different training and different services, because there is no standardization. And the example I was, is anybody aware of an organization called Direct Works?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Direct Works, I'm told, a wide, I think actually probably all of the housing associations that are on this are members of it in some way. But what they're trying to do, that they did an exercise a couple of years ago, checking to see on fire doors whether people were competent. And of 550 people they assessed, there was only 6 that passed the assessment, which is quite a shocking figure. Be interesting to know on cavity barriers.
I don't think any work's ever been done at that level of detail, George, but I'm conscious of the fact here I'm coming up with all of the problems and none of the answers. We do need somebody to set, it's perfectly okay for these courses to exist, but they must meet minimum standards and they must all cover the basics and the best organisation to deliver this is the ASFP, because it's their meat and drink. They represent most of the credible cavity barrier manufacturers. So people like the Association of Brickwork Contractors, for them, candidly, it's a good thing they've done, and they're doing a good job, but it's more of a revenue generation stream than anything else. But you're going to have to, unfortunately, we're going to have training at 2 levels: a general appreciation of what a cavity barrier is and why you use it and why it's important. And there are some common issues and some common instructions to all of them. But then you also require manufacturers training, because it's the manufacturer that's going to have to provide some kind of a warranty or a sign off. And he's going to have some skin in the game by way of training the installer on how to install his particular product.
So, Chris,
and what about maintenance? So, because what you've been talking about largely in terms of the level of information, you know, the brackets and things like that, you would supply that when you were supplying it on a new build. You'd supply it as a complete assembly. But in 5 years' time or something, when somebody's just carrying out some work to just correct something, that's an important area, I feel, that they would need to have the detail of what those component elements were.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you? Sorry. Chris has said an awful lot of stuff, and I'm sure some of that should be in the chat box. Before he forgets what he said, could I ask you, Chris, to add that in? If
you look above, Richard, most of those,
it's already in there.
It's already in there.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. I didn't want it forgotten. I beg your pardon. Carry on with maintenance. I was going to come back to you.
George, typically cavity barriers, with 2 exceptions, suspended ceilings and raised access floors, are once installed, never touched. That's normally the case. So the question there is not so much maintenance, it's a question of what is your anticipated lifespan, or your design life, or however you want to express it for that particular product. At the moment, the demand from the industry at large is for 60 years. So the idea is that a cavity barrier, given that most of these are hidden, you would rarely access them again. If you do have to access them, then in our particular instance, we've gone down the route, and I can only speak for Siderise, of digital object identifiers, where you will have a QR code on the product that you can scan, and it will take you back to web pages held in perpetuity. So it'll tell you everything that you need to know about that particular product.
And that would include what the brackets were, all of
everything. Okay. And if the product has been superseded by another model, it will point you to the replacement model, if that makes sense.
And that would include the intumescent strip and all of the component elements that went to make up that assembly.
Now, George, it wouldn't include the intumescent strip, because you don't sell the intumescent strip separately. It is part of the assembly. It is part of the system. If you damage the intumescent strip, then you would call up and say, I have we would know by the DOI what that product was and what the appropriate strip was to replace that.
So therefore, if that's the case, bearing in mind the fact that we want to have something here that is going to last 50 years, and with respect, Siderise might get bought out by somebody else, and it might change. Sure. Therefore, the asset information should include that detail. Is there any reason why it shouldn't be provided?
This is cutting edge stuff, George, at the moment. BSI Identify have just started this. It's very much in its infancy, and the list of what I would call the things that you have to declare could go down to that granular level if it was required. I'm sure it could, because basically it's just data, and you can declare as much or as there are certain fields that you have to declare, and there are certain fields that are not mandatory, they're normative, informative. So you can have ad nauseum the list of data that you want to put in there, but it's all a question of, as you pointed earlier, is it relevant? is it what you need to be there, and who needs to know?
So therefore, if we, because at the end of the day, you're quite right that the level of detail may be very low, and very few, you might not need it very often, but when you need it, you really need it. So therefore, I think that I'm going to propose that we should be asking for that level of detail, because it can always be filtered out. And BSI, yes, they've got their new initiative coming through, but what they're not doing, in my experience, they don't normally go down to this level of detail. Whereas as far as the golden thread is concerned, that is something that we have to be able to provide, in my view. What do you think, Edward?
I think you definitely need quite rich information, which you're not going to need that you utilize on a day-to-day basis. But if you need to justify something or do a certain type of work, you'll certainly be reliant on that information. Certainly it's gone to the days where we just say, oh, we just get someone competent in to do it. We know we need them to demonstrate their competence, and part of that is the understanding of the product itself, as well as its installation and its maintenance going forward. So it's the really too much information, within reason, it doesn't exist. It's just about how you manage that information, and that's hopefully
George, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that the the DOI platform could be adapted to store an infinite amount of information. At the moment, our DOI, we are limited by the platform because we're part of a group of beta users. So we're kind of working with a common set of data, but in theory, it could be expanded to include everything that you may consider to be even remotely required in the future.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is just overcome this situation where somebody needs the information and then can't get it because it's tied up in. By
the way, just for clarification here, if someone has a damaged piece of cavity barrier, you replace it. You do not repair it.
I appreciate that, but
so you buy the whole unit, not the bits and pieces, not the components. You replace the whole thing.
Is that with our experts on the panel here? We've also got circumstances, I think, where people have said that you might have the building might move, so something may need addressing. Is it the case that you'd always replace the entire unit?
George, the design of the product should be able to accommodate service movement and service under fire load. And it's part of the design specification. You should know if your building's going to move, how much is it going to move, and will the cavity barrier flex and come back and move with that building. If it doesn't, you've got the wrong cavity barrier.
And does that ever happen?
Of course it does. Of course it does.
So if it happens, we need to address it, don't we? We need in some way to address it.
Yeah, my opinion, of course, if you needed to replace a material that had not performed as you'd intended it to, in other words, it hadn't been able to deal with the normal service movement, I would say that's a claim under warranty. If you say something can accommodate 20 mil, 30 mil movement and it doesn't, then you've got a warranty claim, and you would probably be looking at a replacement material for that particular element.
But what do you replace it with?
Well, that very much depends on is the mode of failure down to some use of the product in an inappropriate application? Is it down to an installation issue? Has something fundamentally changed in the building? It could be a whole host of things, George.
And therefore, in my experience, when maintainers are trying to ensure that the building still runs, they can't rely on the warranties to actually address that. They will replace the parts. Yeah.
Possibly, George, possibly. But I'm just trying to highlight is that the practicalities of some of this are quite significant.
No.
Sure. Sorry, can we just get back to the question and carry on maybe afterwards, at least get this one nailed?
Richard, I'm going to have to leave. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to have to leave now. I've got a prior appointment at 12, so I'll catch up with you guys later. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to join another meeting. I did explain to George before I joined.
Thanks, Chris. It's been very
brilliant, Chris.
Yeah,
thank you so
guys.
much.
Cheers,
Excellent.
cheers
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Pauline was going to raise something, Richard.
I was, yeah, I was just going to ask whether we would be capturing then the range of the tolerance of the building's movement. I mean, I don't know if that's already written in some of the answers.
That's a good point. Is that something that should be on this list?
Well, it sounds like it from.
It sounds like, yeah, I agree with you. It certainly does. What does anybody? Sorry, Pauline. Was there anything else?
No, that was it.
No, I think that's a good point. What does anybody else think about that? Is this something we should be capturing? Peter, you're nodding. Speak.
Yeah, I think Pauline's exactly right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it should be. I think I originally raised the query about the building's movements and have seen, aware of cavity barriers and slipping out of place, moving out of place. I agree that they should be specified correctly, but we know that that's not happening in practice. So somehow it is about the system. It is about linking all the information together, and it's about doing the right thing. But so often that's misinterpreted or not applied correctly because of competency failures.
Sure.
Suzanne, we can't hear you very clearly. I don't know if that was just me or. I think you might.
I'll turn my volume up. Sorry.
Thank you. No problem.
Is it a competency failure? Or is it there's two competent people not talking to each other? So somebody who's calculating the building movements and somebody who's fitting the cavity barriers. I don't know who it would be calculating the building movement.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a very interesting point. Would that be the structural engineer? I guess would that be? I don't know.
But regardless, we're saying that it's information we need. Pauline, would you do me a favour and put that in the chat for me so Jess can copy it?
Yep. Okay, I should do that now.
Thank you. So sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so the other question I was going to have on this particular point about the tasks and the schedules, what I think we're saying is Chris has explained that different manufacturers have got different procedures for their particular items, their particular products. So therefore, one of the things that we should be requiring from the manufacturer is a list of tasks that they would consider to be appropriate for their particular product to be installed correctly and also commissioned. I mean, would you say commissioned? I guess I don't know.
What's that? A methodology of installation, George?
Yeah, I think a methodology of installation. Maybe I don't know. Would you do any testing on a cavity barrier? Is there such a thing? I don't know. Anybody know? No.
Edward?
Not in situ. You do your testing in a test facility beforehand, hopefully.
Yeah.
Unless we have a real fire, of course.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the proper test, isn't it?
Steve, what about you? What do you think about this?
A lot of this comes down to the manufacturers, we've said, and normally they're quite guarded on giving away all their crown jewels, as it were.
Sure.
So, as Chris said, we've got to drag them into the 21st century, quick kicking and screaming, and they have to play a part in this, and that's what it's going to come down to.
Could I just reinforce that, Steve? Because I think I've heard that mentioned several times, and it is something that I think that as an industry, as customers like you, we need to be insisting on. And there is an opportunity here to get that. I was looking again, at a declaration of performance for a fire door last week, and I was trying to understand it. And I'm an information management person. I'm not a professional in any way like you guys, but I was just trying to understand if I was going to buy a replacement fire door, whether the performance specification that was given on this particular project was something that would help me. And what I discovered was that it was sufficiently obscure about what the particular performance of that door was, the individual door, what the closer was. It gives me a range of performance that if the door is of this size and of this thickness and of this weight, then it would need this class of door closer, which has been assessed to this particular British standard. But it doesn't actually tell me what the door closer needs to do.
Absolutely agree. It's all about liability, isn't it? And they're trying to shift the emphasis as much as they can onto the end client. And you get a global assessment, it gives you everything you need, but it's what they don't give you that's the interesting part. And you can go all the way back to hack it when we're gaming the system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, in terms to get the manufacturers kicking and screaming into the 21st century, are we saying that would need to be regulatory?
I think it's the only way.
Yeah. Edward's nodding.
Yeah, you're right. We very rarely see actual test reports. We only see global assessments.
Well, the thing is, this is very interesting, and it's a very interesting point for us to use, because remember, we're feeding into those regulations. So this is the forum to actually raise these things and make them clear how strongly we feel about this. George, can I ask you that point you made just a little bit earlier? Could you put that on the chat?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I mean, my thought on this is actually we're buying a service here. It's not just a product. The service is stopping fire spreading, and we should think
that's
in
really,
that holistic way.
Yeah. So does somebody want to type into the chat that we need regulatory? Steve, do you want to do that for me? You're on mute, so I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so that being the case, does anyone have anything they think needs adding in to this question 3, above and beyond what we've already done? Is everyone happy for us to move on from question 3? Anyone unhappy? Pauline, are you putting your hand up?
No, I'm not. Is it?
Oh, no, you're flashing.
Oh, sorry about that. I don't know what's happening.
No, it was a pleasure. Okay, so we'll move on. Just cut and print question 3 and move us up to question 4. Get it loaded up. And George, would you like to introduce question 4?
Yeah, as I was saying earlier, the competency side of things is a given. The question is, who are the competent organisations? And certainly, as we've got there, ASFP is the Association of Specialist Fire Protection, is it? I think. And I've already connected with Niall Rowan, who's the former chief exec, and he's I think going to contribute to this. He's offered to. So what other, I think, Dave, you've put up there ATOs. Is that accredited training organisations?
Yeah, I believe so, yes.
Okay. So how many different organisations are we aware of that are giving this training?
I assume there's quite a number of them. There tends to be in this sort of that sort of training, but I don't know specifically. Yeah,
we almost need a standard for managing that, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right, that's not working very well, is it?
Well, is there anything else that anybody wants to add in terms of the competency and training? I mean, one of the things that I thought was interesting.
It's not loaded up very well on the chat, I'm afraid. Can you see it on the screen? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can anybody not see it on the screen? Sorry, George.
Yeah.
If anybody can't see it, if you could pop a message in chat and just we'll sort it. It's not loaded up in the chat very well.
Could it be a tiny little bit bigger on the screen?
Yeah, could you zoom, Jess?
Thank you.
Can I
is that okay, Pauline?
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Warrington Fire. Can somebody explain to me what Warrington Fire does? Do they do testing like BRE does, as well as training?
Yes, I can confirm that they do.
Yeah.
So do a full service. Yeah.
Yes, Suzanne. Sorry, your microphone is so quiet. I can't hear a word.
You were clear right at the beginning, Suzanne.
Yeah, at the beginning it was fine.
Sorry. Can you hear
that's better.
Can
That's
you hear me now? Yeah, sorry, I put the headphones in, but they are glitchy.
You carry on, Suzanne.
Sorry. Yeah, no, Warrington do provide full service. They do testing. They've got test facilities in the UK, probably equal to the BRE's facilities.
And Dave, is that something that your organisation does as well?
I believe they can test anything. Yeah, whether they actually do that on these products at the moment or not, I'm not sure. But yeah, they do have test facilities in East Kilbride and down in Fareham, I believe, as well.
Okay. Yeah, Dave works for a company called TUD, is it?
Tuvsud, TUVSUD.
Okay. Yeah, so if we're agreed that the competency side of things, oh yeah, that was the other point I was going to make on this. The training information that Chris was talking about that is manufacturer specific, we should be getting that information from the manufacturers in a form that then could be delivered maybe as YouTubes or toolbox talks and things like that. Would that make sense? Should we be asking for that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other.
So it's a question of how the training is actually delivered rather than just waiting for them to come to a classroom type thing.
Yes. Well, I think
that's interesting, isn't it?
I think one of the questions as well is
so training. Sorry. So in terms of our question, that manufacturers' training should be readily accessible.
Yes, agreed.
Which at the moment we're saying it isn't. Would that be correct?
It seems that that's the case, but what would you say, guys?
I think there's one thing we need to recognise is there's different levels of expertise, and perhaps what you need to know as a bricklayer to install cavity barriers in brick walls is very different to, say, an open state cavity barrier in a rain screen system. So there needs to be a recognition within all of this that there's going to be different levels of training and certification, because otherwise we make it impossible for certain trades to actually operate.
Absolutely, but that needs to be defined as well, doesn't it? But
so there's a whole sort of syllabus framework, isn't there?
Yeah, as there should be, Edward, as there should be.
Yeah,
one would think, really.
So I mean, that's something that it's reasonable for us to require, isn't it?
Yeah.
As the Golden Thread Initiative, if you're going to be a manufacturer that is supplying product, then you should be providing your basic training in a form that can then be consumed.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, some of these operations should be part of your trade training. So if you're a bricklayer, you are taught to put cavity barriers in a brick wall when you do your training. So it becomes part of that. Certainly, you know, I was a bricklayer, and we were
so are we saying for a bricklayer, for example, it wouldn't be so product specific?
Well, you'd have probably some generic training, then you would need some product specific information. Let's face it, there's some manufacturers out there who provide excellent instructions. And that's all it is, step-by-step instructions, how to use their products and any pitfalls. Others actually provide nothing, and that is where the problem lies. I think if you have good generic training for certain products and then you have good instructions, that may be adequate. Other more complex
So this comes down to regulation again, doesn't it? It needs to be a regulatory requirement, obviously. One would think that there's adequate information, adequate training for all of these products.
And for each product, the decision made whether instructions are adequate or product specific training with maybe some hands-on aspect of assessment, a practical assessment is required. So, you know, there has to be a decision. Is this complex enough to warrant having a practical assessment?
Yeah, it needs to be part of the compliance package, doesn't it?
Yeah, I would say that it may not be regulatory, because if we're relying on regulation to do everything, then that could be a big challenge, because you've then got all sorts of different items. I think that could be that just as building owners, you require that as part of your information requirements, and therefore basically, unless a product that requires some specialist expertise to install it, unless it's accompanied with training material, people can't use it. That seems reasonable, doesn't it? You know, that's a
so make it industry-led, George.
Yeah, exactly. Is that something that we should be asking for?
A code of practice.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah. Because if for example, you know, everybody uses YouTube now, so therefore, if it's no great issue for people to have that information available freely. You know, if you've got a washing machine or something like that, you can always go and look at the information on that. You don't. A few years ago, if you wanted a new manual because you'd lost your old manual, you had to go and buy one. That's no longer the case, is it? You know, so I think that's something that we, you know, as an industry, we should be asking for. Cool. Okay.
Can I throw something out there from a position of complete ignorance? Since we're doing quite well for time, just kind of a weird one out from left field. Should some of this information we're asking for on buildings be confidential, secret almost? Oh, is there the possibility that the wrong people could get hold of this information or not?
I suppose there's always the potential. It depends on the building and the nature of the.
I'm just wondering if it needs that some of this stuff shouldn't necessarily be in the public domain. It needs to be has some sort of security going on it. Maybe not. It was just a thought, really.
No, you're right, Richard. And there is some of this information that we need to be able to filter out, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be gathering it.
Oh no, absolutely not. As I say, this was just a thought.
Yeah. What the answer to that question, I think, is how the information is delivered and presented. So, for example, James Carpenter, who's at L&Q, has said to me that what he's particularly concerned about is making sure that tenants get the appropriate information. Now, if you overwhelm them with too much information, or quite frankly, give them information that they could use against you, He didn't say that, by the way. But that's problematic. But that's not a problem. That isn't a difficulty from an information management perspective, which is my sort of bag, because if we've got a way of just delivering the information that is relevant to that particular, to a tenant, then that can just be filtered out from the master data set. Sorry, Suzanne.
Hi, yeah, I was going to say I completely agree with that, and I think we've had many conversations internally and with L&Q and other housing associations about data and the management of information, and I mean a live discussion at the moment is around the PEEPs, personal emergency evacuation plans, and the information of vulnerable people in premises information boxes, and the data security around that, and there's a whole debate going on around that, but I agree with that, and I think you need to be careful what information you do put into the public domain, because it does need to be read in context, and sometimes you can overwhelm people with complex information that can be taken out of context and then have, you know, just a rolling PR nightmare / misinterpretation / legal complications, and that's not to say, because I think that's not to say it's wrong, you just need to handle the information correctly. Because of all the different key stakeholders, and you do need to be protective of it into some regard, and not necessarily put it out there in the public domain, because for various reasons, and that's not to say there's something to hide, just that it needs to be managed appropriately.
Well, the thing is, when you give people information, what you need to also ensure is that they're going to understand it.
Yeah.
So often it almost goes hands in glove. There's an element of education involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not just about supplying information. They've got to be able to understand it.
Absolutely. You know, there's been a long running debate about making fire risk assessments available for residents, which I think most landlords now do, because fire risk assessments are written in a very sort of broad context, and probably can be interpreted by lay persons. But when you start to get into some of the technical stuff that we're talking about now, you do need to have it in a different context.
Well, transparency then suddenly becomes opaque, doesn't it? Because they can't see through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just on that point, what you just said there, Suzanne, fire risk assessments, one of the things that we've been looking at is whether fire risk assessments could be standardized in a way that then becomes then machine readable, so that you're then able to do proper comparisons, to be able to find things more easily, rather than it being currently, all the ones I've seen have been narratives. What would your take on that be?
I think in terms of fire risk assessments, I mean, they've evolved now very much into something that is a tick box exercise almost, you know, and where you did have a template. We now have a template in the PAS 79, and people have sort of manipulated that over the period of time. And I think from moving forward, and I mean, Ed will have more about this, but in terms of safety case, I don't think that there's going to be a template around safety case or a template around gathering information, for the very reason that it needs to be organic, it needs to be dynamic, it needs to be your own. You need to think about it rather than just ticking boxes and populating information in a.
Could I just bring in just briefly Mwenzi, who's been doing a lot of work on fire risk assessments for us. Do you just want a quick word on that?
No, I was like, my ears perked up there. Yeah, I do agree. I think having gone through the PAS and looked at several different companies' risk assessments, and also looked at what was going on historically, because historically the risk assessments were done by the fire service, and then it was handed over to the individual building owners or responsible person to complete. And I think personally, I think that's where it's fallen down. because as you've just said, it's been said, it's become very organic to the point that in some instances, no, that the risk assessments are so extremely far apart now, there is no consistency. And like I think we discussed before, George, about the fact that people doing the risk assessments, if they're hiring outside risk assessors, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have any understanding of actual fire.
Pauline, what do you think about that?
Well, we do have, similar to what's been said, an internal kind of template which has over the years.
You have got a template, okay.
We have got an internal template that is used by our assessors, but it has become, although it is still largely narrative, it has become more of a tick box exercise over the years.
Okay.
So I guess the question is, I wasn't quite clear. So do we think it's a good idea for us to have some form of standardisation of fire risk assessments?
Suzanne's saying no.
Well, I think you're never going to get away from it. I think it is what it is now, isn't it? It's a done deal. Fire risk assessments are standardised pretty much. And I think that's the way they're going to be. I don't think moving forward we should standardise what we're looking at in terms of safety case, BIM, digitalisation. I think we should stay away from, because it makes them people own the data, own their own data, makes it much more organic and relevant.
Should the safety case, I definitely agree that it must not be a tick box, but my suggestion would be that it still should be structured. So there ought to be a standard process that is capturing information about certain elements. So, for example, I don't know if you know Noel Pells from PRP. So I'm working with Noel to better understand the methodology that he's following. And what we're trying to do is to say, how can we make sure that, for example, just a particular asset type. If we look at, we've been looking at the new BS 8644 draft that's out at the moment, and what there's elements in there which are both asset types that are mentioned, but again they're just generic, and also there's information that needs to be captured against those asset types, and though that we could be standardizing down at that level, so that, for example, when we are talking about a different type of cavity barrier, it is being classified, or more than that, it's actually being named in a consistent way, so that the circumstances under which that particular cavity barrier and that particular risk, again, we could be classifying the risks. So we're standardizing the way risks are being described. Now, that doesn't mean that you're then taking away the intellectual interpretation of the expert saying, under these circumstances, that was the risk. But does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're talking about standardization of process and methodology rather than actually finite outcomes. So just to get back to the questions, so are we happy? You know what I'm going to say, don't you? Are we happy with question 4? Anybody unhappy with or wants to add anything in? Speak now or forever hold your peace on question 4.
Hello, Chris. Back again.
I've managed to cut short my meeting. I was fast. I didn't want to miss the kind of the end of the show, as it were. So
you haven't missed the end of the show. You just missed the end of number 4. We're going to go straight on to number 5. Cut and print number 4, Gister. And we're going to put number 5 up there, which George is shortly going to introduce. George, welcome back, Chris.
Okay, so change management. this is probably one of the biggest conundrums that we have during the design and construction process. And I would argue that it's also a major problem in terms of ongoing operational management. And one of the real challenges with it in both circumstances is the fact that people aren't adequately recording what was there in the first place that was changed from. And this includes in the new build side of things, where the information is often initially put in by, let's say, an architect or an M&E consultant about the type of product that the design was expected to be supporting. And then when it goes out to contractors, they then swap them out. And there's all sorts of good reasons why they do that. Some of it is cost, some of it's availability. But because we don't have a proper record of what was specified in the first place or suggested in the first place, you've got no track to say that was what it was and this is what it is. So one of the things we're trying to do in the BIM world is then actually be far more clear about what was intended to be used, even if it wasn't specified. So that when a contractor then uses the technical submittal process, and we're suggesting all of the asset types that are critical to fire safety should have to go through a technical submittal process, then running through that. Is anybody on the call unaware of what the technical submittal process is in construction? Would you like me to explain it? So everybody's familiar with that. Cool. And therefore, would you agree that from an operational perspective, because most of you are involved in looking after existing estates, aren't you? Would you agree that a technical submittal process is a viable way of addressing change management in operational side of things? Any input to that?
Just say the first part of the question again, George, and change management.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that if you've got if a door closer needs replacing,
yeah,
my view is that you ought to be the contractor that's replacing it ought to be providing somebody, let's say you as the client, with an example of what they're replacing.
Yep.
With what they're replacing and what
yeah
they're
yeah, absolutely. We need to we you know, we don't have that level of detail, but that's where we need to be at if we're going to effectively manage our buildings properly and be able to demonstrate to the regulator. Then we need to be going to that kind of detail and have that change management processes in place.
Excellent. Okay. Well,
Emma, we haven't heard from you for a long time, have we? Are you still there? If you are, you're on mute. She's making a coffee.
Yeah, we're not trying to catch people out. It's just that it's very easy for people to.
Yeah, no, I just don't want people not to get missed out. That's the point. I'm seeing like eight pictures on the screen, but then I've got people down the side, and I don't want them to feel left out because we don't see them.
Yeah.
Of course, maybe they want to be left out.
So the change, Chris, from a manufacturer's perspective, I don't know if how relevant is this to you, having a change management process?
Massively, for a whole host of operational reasons. The amount of times we go to site and say we've got site, particularly in the current climate where people are stripping buildings back and kind of inspections, the amount of times we turn up when somebody said your products were specified, we assume they've been used turn up and it's somebody else's materials is biblical. I'd say it's 6 out of 10. So to the point now where we say, we'll come, but if it's an abortive visit, we're going to charge you for it. We haven't got the time to go around chasing unicorns all day. It is a problem, and one that to some degree is endemic across all of the industry, not only to do with cavity barriers, what was specified being swapped out. If I could be slightly controversial as well, it's nice you talked about the supply chains, George. It's generally down to the cost or the price of the product. And that's primarily, in my experience, and I've had a lot of it, is people's reasons for changing products are more to do with putting money in their back pocket and not somebody else's. And the process for managing those changes is depends on the project, the project management itself. Some of them are very good. Some of them are, they're managing the changes after the event. Someone's installed something, closed the building up, and then they do some kind of a backward or kind of review of something that's already happened. It's shocking.
Yeah.
Suzanne, are you as a client, are you included in the discussion when, well, even on a new build, do you have adequate access? Are you involved in when products are being selected and swapped out?
I have been, and I can be, and I say me because it was a previous role that I was doing. I'm not at the moment, but that's because I've changed roles. But Ed and I both have worked in our development team over the last few years, and been very involved with what's gone on site, and followed the processes and procedures through in construction since Grenfell's for the last few years. And we definitely can be, but we're not always consulted as the client. Sometimes it happens and we're not asked, it just happens. Then we may go to site and find that that's happened and then have to sort of pick that up. So it's how good the quality management system is that the contractor on site follows. And you know, your EA and so forth in terms of the data provision.
Is it fair to say that we ought to be insisting on it under the golden thread?
Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. You know, the every nut and bolt, really, maybe not nut and bolt, but you know, pretty much that level of detail should be recorded on these buildings, and should be reflective as built, not what was put through building control to get sign off through building control and then make it up as you go along.
Reality.
Yeah, that's the reality. People push it through building control and then just start over and do whatever they see on the shelf.
Reality, not the history.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we need history as well, but you know what I mean.
For if this is going to be as it is, as the, you know, the government wants, the public wants, everybody wants, you know, if we are going to be true to the golden thread and true to improving, then we should be having this in place and working towards that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, I've worked in many industries, and in any other industry, it's kind of like, well, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course.
The golden thread.
This is the only industry I've come across where it's like, it's new.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're actually going to keep a record of what actually happened.
Yeah,
and it's
absolutely.
Revolutionary. It's very strange. Very
the
strange.
golden thread should be the gold standard in terms of information provision.
Yeah, well, it should be the norm.
Suzanne. Yeah. Well, yeah, it should be the norm, and you should, you know, I mean, is it 9997 doesn't allow you to go below legal standard. You know, it doesn't in a management system. You can't fail a minimum legal standard. You have to have that, or you have to be doing better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Chris.
I just wanted to make the point that there has been a marked change in the attitudes towards the cavity barriers, people do tend to respect the specifications now. There is more care being taken on buildings that are being constructed today. Grenfell has highlighted the whole need for a holistic approach and to do the things correctly. I see the biggest challenges in remedial works and in legacy projects. We're being asked now to dig out records from 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's going to get worse because now the government has given the possibility to people, they've extended the period of time when someone can take action. So for us at the moment, we've got a massive program at the moment of trying to codify and put in one place all of the information from all of the various systems, CRM and accounts that we've had from years gone by, so we can try and access them. And going forward as well, that's another impetus for us wanting to use the digital object identifiers. So if Suzanne wants to look at what she needs to replace my cavity barrier with, she can get her facilities man to scan the code and it'll tell her what it was and what the replacement product is.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Peter.
I think I've probably been digesting and having my banana over the last 10 minutes.
Okay. I knew that banana was coming out.
But, I thought it's really interesting, especially what you were saying, Chris, about people not understanding and the change. And I was just thinking what processes we have in place. We're probably a bit behind Suzanne and Edward in terms of the work with our development team. There's probably a hard line between handover and I guess where we've been notified of change, it's always been positive. So do you want us to put sprinklers in this building? Do you want to make this cladding non-combustible? Whereas if there's money savings, I can't think of an instance when we've been told or asked, do we want to go for a cheaper product? Are you happy with that? So that was really interesting.
That's good to know, Peter. My experiences are unfortunately as a result of too many years in this industry and watching things, designs being murdered at the altar of, I think they call it, what do they call it? Design engineering or whatever it is. Just an excuse to make things cheaper and less effective.
Value engineering, value.
That's it, value engineering.
We can add value.
Pauline, I think you've got your hand up, haven't you?
I think in the defence of value engineering, it's the term's been misused because you've got to keep the value.
Exactly.
Here is cost engineering.
It's a misnomer, isn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely. It is. Pauline, you have your hand up.
It's a development out of the Second World War of finding electronic devices that would do the same job because of shortages.
Yeah. Pauline.
Yeah, basically we have the same kind of issues that have been already spoken about. In terms of being the last point of handover of accepting buildings from development into operations, we don't tend to get notified of any changes unless it is a positive change. Anything else we find out by shock, horror or surprise sometimes.
I would add in there, sometimes you're asked because they want to assign liability to someone else.
Yeah, there is that, yeah.
Okay, can I just bring us back to the question and the answers? Have we all looked at that? Has anybody not had a look through the updated answers? I'll take that as no, that we have all looked through. That being the case, is there anything that is glaringly missing that needs adding in, or can we cut and print? We're cutting and printing, Jess. Well done, we've done it. Excellent. That's a very good result, and we have 15 minutes left. Can I just actually make a little pitch right now on behalf of BIM4Housing? Some of you are obviously already members and join us in our work. If any of you would like to, whether on an ongoing basis or just dip in and out to our working groups or our work streams, just put a note in the chat and Jess will be in touch with you and tell you our agenda, and it would be very good to welcome any and all. Now, I'm sure George has got an interesting topic to finish off with.
Yeah, I'd like to see if we can basically get a few minutes, not now, but a few minutes from people to look at the data templates that we're trying to develop for the BIM4Housing associations. The way in which we're going about this is to we've identified about 200 asset types, of which we've got about 20 that are specifically for that are specific for fire. But you know, Chris, for example, when we shared it with him, he pointed out that cavity barriers weren't even on there, and part of the reason for that was that it was actually
George, you're breaking up.
Okay.
Yeah,
Still?
I don't know why. You're breaking up a bit, so I'm not sure if people are catching everything.
Okay, is that still the case?
No, that's fine now.
Okay. Yeah, what we discovered was that the BIM4Housing Association master list was actually made up from things that the maintenance team were maintaining. And as Chris said earlier, because you don't maintain cavity barriers, they were left out. So therefore, what we're now trying to do is to bring that around. So what I'm asking for is to see if we can get some support from people to actually look through and look at what these characteristics are and decide if there are things that you would ask for that are needed, that are missing. So if I, this is the working group that we've got underway at the moment. It's under the UK BIM Alliance. We've got at the moment Peabody, Southern Housing, and L&Q have been feeding into this, but we'd like to expand that, obviously. And the idea basically is to be able to start create standard data templates for types of products, and then use those to inform what information is required. So standard information requirements. And by doing that, we've got something that can then be used for existing buildings and new buildings. And we can then use that to tell product manufacturers what information we need. So Chris, for example, will be able to inform Chris of the information that we need from a point of view of fire, but also probably things like environmental requirements.
Yeah.
And then we can also put the procedures in as well. So this is where we're trying to get to, which we can then feed into whatever software applications are being. So would everybody want to just be included in that round robin? Is that something that you'd be willing to take a look at for?
I'm happy to do that, George. That's no problem.
Great, thank you. Steve as well? Yeah, I see that.
George, I think I'm already involved, aren't I, in the sense we've already had discussions. So I'm happy to continue with our sessions and exchanges. So fine.
Thank you. It's not a matter of getting into sort of BIM speak and all the rest of it, which, you know, quite frankly, we can interpret, you know, we can simplify that. The idea basically is to be able to make sure that the right bit of information is needed. See, for example, what I've discovered going through the new British Standard, they've got a number of new properties that haven't been mentioned before. And I'm presuming if they're in the British Standard that somebody wants to collect them. But these are the new British, these are the new requirements. You resistance to fire, structure, integrity, insulation. That particular one, I really don't understand why they've got that as an attribute, and I think that's going to be questioned. But you've got things like here, angle to datum and fire exposure direction, which I can imagine are specific to certain types of products. So we need to figure out whether these questions are ones that we want to incorporate in the data templates. So, for example, Chris, how many of these attributes are going to be relevant to your product range? You know, so if we can get people's view on this, then we can then properly feed back to people like Chris and your installers and people that are maintaining the buildings, so that we're making sure that the data that you need to have is there. Because one of the things that's very apparent to me is the way the original golden thread definition was written. It puts the liability on the accountable people and the responsible people. And I can't see how a building safety manager can be expected to know all the information they need to know about a product without being told what that information is likely to be. It seems to me that all that's happening is that risk is being transferred. Or part of my goal with the work that we're doing here is to try and inform that, so that we're actually giving you the right information. Do you agree? We've got some building safety managers on this, haven't we? Peter, are you a building safety manager?
Yep. So I'm without portfolio at the moment, so it means that I don't have any buildings in scope. But yeah, so my fellow building safety managers, yeah, I guess feel that kind of how that evidence case, how that safety case will kind of look, and how the evidence of that building's safe.
George, I don't know if you're aware, it might have some oblique reference. REBA have just launched a fire safety compliance tracker, which is bound to be data heavy and require boxes to be ticked and fields to be filled and all of that other good stuff. So it'd be interested, what, as a manufacturer, my biggest concern with all of the data requirements is having a common format. So ideally we can put it in one place and disseminate to many different ports. What you ask us is easy. It's just about that everybody keeps coming up with a completely different way of expressing the same attribute. One man's resistance to fire is another man's reaction to fire. One man's cavity bar is another man's perimeter fire seal, and it's creating a work with that's really adding now value. So I suppose in respect to the golden thread, our concern as manufacturers, we end up producing the same information, but having to adapt it to suit the various platforms that seem to be springing up left, right and centre. And the latest one is the REBA Fire Safety Compliance Tracker. And I've asked them what's it all about, and it's only available to REBA members. So I don't even know what information is required in it or what data they need. So that's a great start. So we need a little bit more of joined up thinking. We need a bit more transparency.
Yeah, one of the things that you would be using, or you will be using, Chris, is something that we've developed called the Templater. So the Templater is a software application that as ActivePlan we developed, and we gave it to the BRE.
Is that the one the guys they haven't had the access to yet?
Yeah.
Okay.
We gave it to the BRE, and the BRE is giving it to the industry under the Construction Products Association. We insisted that we'd only give it to everybody if it was going to be completely free.
So it's open source then, really, of a type.
Yeah, it's completely free to use, and the information is being stored on the BRE servers as well. So it's not going into any commercial organisation.
That's useful to know.
Yeah, so, but the important thing about it is exactly as you're saying there. What we're trying to do is get commonly agreed terms. But what we can do from a software engineering point of view, the fact that you've got perimeter seal or whatever the other term was that you used there, it doesn't really matter, because if you've got different people who want to consume the information using different terminology, that's fine. It just means that we use lookup tables and map them to accord. But it means that from your point of view, you answer the question in a language that you are comfortable with,
Yeah.
and then behind the scenes we translate it.
Good.
So there's quite a lot of work going on with the Construction Innovation Hub in that as well, so that we can use the something called ontology, which is a way that information can be presented differently under different circumstances. So if your cavity barrier is being used in one context, it will take on board certain properties, and if it's being used in a different context, the same cavity barrier will carry different information as well. So we're trying to sort out that behind the scenes. The important thing is for us to know what Suzanne needs in terms of information.
Yeah.
And that's the missing bit that nobody's got. And that's what we're trying to achieve here. Cool. I think we're done.
I think we are, and I think we've done very well, don't you?
Well, I'm very pleased.
So, excellent result, excellent meeting. Thank you very, very much. And I have to say, the reason we've actually even had some spare time is because so many of you took the time out before the meeting to, as George would put it, do your homework. So fantastic, and thank you all very, very much for your effort. And make no mistake, this time has not been wasted. We'll use it well.
Cheers,
We've got 4 more of these workshops coming up. One tomorrow on AOVs, which Suzanne's involved with, and I think Pauline is as well. And also we've got another one on cavity barriers in a few weeks' time. So what we're trying to do is then take all of that and then feed that, interpret that. It's a fair old job that Richard and Jess have got to try and digest that. But I think we've, I think we've structured it in a way that makes it easier for everybody. So thank you.
And I hope that once we've got the output, that you'll help us disseminate it, because there's no value in us talking to ourselves.
Yeah. So I'll set you all up as users on this data template side of things. And if you could take just a little bit of your time to look at the information, we'll try and make it as consumable as possible, because we've got the opportunity here of really writing the rules if we can. Good. Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.